Hey, everybody. Today I'm joined by Raymond de Oliveira. Ray is a brilliant mind and someone I've come across through the QRI Quality Research Institute group, and have had a couple conversations with Ray online, but member of the Metamodern spirituality group, and has a lot of insight and wisdom, I think, especially around forms of Buddhist meditation, issues of non-duality and meditation practice. A lot of background familiarity with the work of Daniel Ingram and the kind of pragmatic Dharma stuff that he's putting out. So there's been some really interesting engagements with that. Today we're going to have kind of a conversation, mostly informal, but get into some issues that have come up in the kind of metamodern emergentist space recently. I think what at least kind of catalyzed this thought of doing this was initially to talk about the issue of suffering and the amelioration of suffering, and how we might think of that in terms of how I've articulated it from an emergentist standpoint, as I'm trying to do. But Ray has his own ideas. Yeah, I wanted to talk about suffering, compassion, meditation, enlightenment, transhumanism, emergentism with Ray, and just see where all that takes us. So anyway, Ray, thanks for taking the time, and I expect we'll get into some interesting things.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Brendan. These are some of my favorite topics. I think what catalyzed it is that I think maybe just some keywords to throw in there and see what we dialogue out. I brought up the is-alt fallacy, or problem that David Hume's, had been credited with bringing our attention to. And the idea is that, from a scientific understanding and description of what is happening in actuality and of the map, it is not enough. It is not sufficient information for us to fully derive what we ought to be doing. What are the moral imperatives? And so in emergentism, philosophy or religion, as much as I've read and understood it, seems to be trying to pull from the map of, okay, like this is what's happening, guys. And from that, there may even be what's happening is that we're moving towards an evolutionary teleology. And I'm all for that. And so I appreciate that we're recognizing the patterns that we're seeing, and like not being gaslit into saying like, nothing's going anywhere. But this doesn't quite answer one of the questions that I believe most religions answer, which is what we ought to be doing with our lives. And so in the attempt to bridge that, I would claim requires that we have a will to power, that we actually assert a moral imperative here that isn't really grounded in the science. And that's okay. And that has to be how it has to be. It has to be such that we're not a priori superior in the meme wars from deciding that this is what we ought to do, and someone else decides this is something else they ought to be doing, and they're totally different from us. And then we can't just say, well, because of the territory, you're clearly wrong. Like, you clearly should not be prioritizing what you prioritize because of science, right? And I don't think that's a good faith argument at the end of the day, because ultimately that is not enough information to be conclusive.
Okay,
You have to win the fight. You have to win the war.
Let's let me unpack that a little bit, just so again people have a little bit more context here, because I think that'd be helpful. So to link all this to what you're just saying, and then to try to dig into that some, rehearsing a little bit what my claim would be, which is that if you look at the broad big history picture of reality, starting with the Big Bang till now, you can trace a complexification narrative that is inherently tied to the increase of agency, so power, and the increase of goodness through the deepening of consciousness that becomes more aware of suffering, more aware of imperfection, and then that awareness tied to greater capacity to ameliorate or to fix that problem. And that if you look at even what's unfolded, or I should say especially what's unfolded in human history, particularly over the past, say, 500 years, that there is a marked trajectory in the direction of the good. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And what I guess what you're getting at is that there is a claim kind of implicit there that this is the way it is, and that is sort of assuming the ought of like the goodness there, the ought being the what should we do, the ethical stance. And that, I guess what I am trying to say is that they are intrinsically related, and that we can look to science, we can look to history and reality as a guide to that increasing ethical awareness that leads to increased ethical responsibility and the decrease of suffering in the world. Now, so that would be my claim, and it sounds to me like there's two things going on there. One, you're contesting whether or not that move makes sense of jumping from that is to the ought. You're still saying that there's something else that we need to work out there philosophically, it sounds like. And then two, and I guess this would be a question, do you contest that broad narrative trajectory? Like, would you be saying actually things have gotten worse, or they haven't necessarily gotten better, or what have you? So I guess those would be two things to dig into from
Yeah,
that.
it's a good question. I would say it's eventually like a mathematical question. I'm not sure I'm very convinced about the math either way when it comes to the net integral of suffering or bliss of all sentient beings across, maybe even like this time slice versus a million years ago versus 100 million years ago. Not entirely sure. Nature is brutal. Before humans came around, I'm not saying it was a glory days of everyone living in a little paradise where no one was hurt. There were predators and genocides among all kinds of species, constantly, just total warfare. And you might say that humans came along and perfected warfare and made it much more efficient. And eventually, by hegemony of the human anthropological lens, we brought about some saving grace of civilization to the madness. But I'm not entirely sure because now we eat like 1 trillion fishes a year. Trillions, sea animals. Hansi says that in his books. And actually, that was a large part in turning me vegan when I just realized that the great, immense, amount of suffering that we inflict on sentient beings every single year. It's an unfathomable amount of suffering when you add it all up. And so I'm not sure, but I think it's a mathematical question. I don't want to take a dogmatic view on that. I think that one day we might get much better at the science of measuring bliss and suffering. And when we do, we can solve these mathematical problems better. In the meantime, we only have some heuristics, perhaps. And I think you would better employ your epistemic virtues to try and get at a better approximation of whether this is a plus or minus on the grand scheme of things. I think the way the philosophical conversation has been had around this have been not enough about the math. Like if you gave me a back of an envelope, you'd be like, okay, every year that's like 10 billion sentient beings being born and like 8 billion being killed. And how are they being killed today? You can say, based on these other statistics, they're suffering less during the death process and their lifespan is better because they're going through factory farms instead of being hunted consistently throughout their whole life. So the amount of anxiety and fear is on net, lower in their entire life than they used to be. Like I can see some of those arguments coming through, but I don't think any of them can be rigorous enough to really nail this to the ground. I think holding a little agnosticism to maybe in the broader spectrum of things, negative utilitarianism versus positive utilitarianism. Is it even worthwhile having a life? Is even a single life today in the modern world for humans net positive, having lived, given you will suffer, you will get sick, you will go through all these pains, you probably aren't going to get enlightened, statistically speaking, for now at least, until maybe a decade from now, who knows? But I think those are all up for grabs and up for debate. Healthy mathematical debate, healthy, rational, scientifically, grounded numbers.
Okay, a couple questions. So this is good. This is interesting. There's a lot here, and I don't know if we'll even be able to get into all this, but a few things up front. I wanted to name a couple isms because I feel like they're kind of pivot points. They're I think they draw some meaningful distinctions. So three of them: utilitarianism, which actually you just named, Gnosticism, and transhumanism. I just want to throw all these out because I consider myself none of these. I find really fundamental problems with all of them, and they are also things that I've critiqued in various ways, or at least raised questions about in various contexts, including QRI contexts, that sometimes get some pushback in the sense of, maybe things like transhumanism, or maybe some tenets of Gnosticism might even be seen to be attractive in some of these communities, at least by some people. And I'm wary of that. And I could go into that, but I'm not being interviewed here. I'm interviewing you, but I just wanted to throw that out there because, again, I want to try to frame this for people of what I think some of the stakes are. So utilitarianism, I find problematic because of some of the ways of thinking that you were kind of just naming. And if you look at the history of trying to do this, it usually winds up going in a rather absurdist direction of quantifying qualia, and then this got into the hedons that you would count and this sort of a thing, and ultimately I find it, not only has it been sort of an unsuccessful paradigm and that it hasn't yielded any particularly productive fruits, I would argue, but I think it's just philosophically kind of misguided. We can, of course, and should look to various metrics to assess whether we're being successful, right? So if you are talking about, 1 trillion fish being consumed per year and that sort of a thing, right? You can make those kinds of analyses and comparisons. And I'm not saying that they're not worthwhile, but that also something, the essence of the lived reality of life seems to be left out of that. And I think that one of the things that, say, integral theory might be able to offer us here, right, is that there really is a split between like the left and the right side of things, the interior and the exterior, and that one of the, I suppose you could say, the false philosophical presumptions of utilitarianism is that we can reduce things to that right hand exterior side and then sort of explain everything in those terms, that the quality becomes scientific and then quantifiable, and then so
maybe we can deal with the utilitarian one, right? First. So I think there's an intuitive sense to it. I would also say I'm not a very I'm not the most classical utilitarian, right? So utility, I would say I would replace with valence being a source of more ultimate value. Now you might say, okay, well, what's the metric? What's a unit of valence here? It's a good question, right? Maybe you do it like one day we'll have a currency that's like, maybe we can like inject you with some kind of shock that will align all your electromagnetic consciousness fields or something, and then you'll feel this moment of great resonance for a second. And so we have these like second shocks that we can give people or wirehead, and then people can trade in pure utility, pure valence, and then you can have an economy based on ultimate meaning. But I will say that the measuring part is intuitive if you think in terms of pain scales that we've developed. So they have done science where they've done large surveys on what bug bites are more painful than other bug bites. And it's more intuitive when you think of just one bug bite versus 2 bug bites. Are you able to say that there is probably some quantifiable, like consistency across people when they say how much more painful are 2 bug bites from the same bug than 1 bug bite, right? And if you can say, well, one is not just like qualitatively more or like unquantifiably more painful than the other, you can say that there's a consistency in the delta here between those experiences. Then you start having scales. You start being able to have a scale of utility, almost of negative utility, but it's more clear that way. Now there's some behind the science. It's like more clear. Pain seems to be more clearly evident in the brain regions than bliss. But we're improving on the science there, and that's, I think, largely hindered currently by our lack of measurement tools that are sophisticated enough. And so that makes me think, should I just go into a career of creating neuroimaging tools? In fact, it's the greatest leverage point. But that aside, I would stop there. What do you say to that? Like those scales of pain, and also even like the Scoville, metrics of how hot something is, and that seems consistently like, oh yeah, like 1 million is like X% more.
I think I'm totally on board with that. I agree. And you mentioned Hansi earlier, and there's something that he kind of works in there in the state, range, right? Everything from hell to bliss or whatnot. Yeah. And I'm totally fine with that. I think that at individual levels, that is tenable. I think it becomes a lot more difficult to do it than when you're looking at collectives of people and trying to then, well, all right, there's at least two elements here. There's the complexity involved, which could theoretically still be just a mathematical problem, right? If you're able to do this sort of quantifying at the individual level, hypothetically, I suppose you could just multiply that by blah 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 blah. You just have to get all the variables right. Now, problem with that is I think that there's a built-in assumption there that is, I think, has a kind of classical reductionist ring to it that goes all the way back to those reductionists who thought, oh, well, it's like Laplace's demon, if you just had all the measurements, you could make these sorts of things. And I just think that things are a lot more chaotic, complex, and uncertain than all that. So that'd be one. Two, I would say that while I, as one person, can articulate my pain level on let's call it like a rough quantitative scale, trying to compare scales between people is impossible, I would say, because we lack, at least with any degree of mathematical certainty. I mean, again, you could get rough estimates, right? If everyone's using the same scale and we're all taking the measurements and we're all saying, well, this feels a lot like this, then I guess you could get some kind of data that might be insightful. But I just don't know how much further you could go beyond that, because at a certain point you get stuck within the individual conscious experience of valence and qualia, and we don't yet have any way of getting into other people's heads. So trying to make any kind of objective science out of experience and suffering and bliss in that way seems like it would also be hindered by that. So the complexity and the intersubjective problem, I think, would be two big problems.
Sure. So let me bring in a few things. I used to be like this. I used to be very much against quantification of a lot of philosophical ideas because I started off in the liberal arts. And one thing that convinced me was for you to say that something is not tractable by science, that it cannot actually be added to by this desire for quantification that comes from a certain scientific process, right? You would have to look at science and say, the leading edge of science for the last 50, 100 years, whatever, I could give them a fair chance, right? Like 50 to 100 years. Has science made any progress at elucidating this problem in greater rigor and detail that was non-trivial in improving our understanding? And like even the technology might be downstream of that. Like maybe you don't have technology within 100 years, but like math is 100 years ahead of it being implemented either. So you have to look at the tests that we're doing at the leading edge and say, is there anything interesting going on there? And if like for 50 to 100 years, science has made no progress on the understanding of bliss and suffering, if it's made no progress in ameliorating it and in their quantification, thereby improving the world, then you could say, yeah, maybe this is not a problem for science. Maybe it's definitely not something that numbers can add to and only obscures the real thing that to do and to focus on and to talk about. But I would say, if you take from emergentism, the Bayesian updating and the Bayesian process that is formalized by the scientific process, which leads to all this quantification, all this desire to quantify is part of the formalization of that engine of life, right? I would say that it has been the only thing that's really borne a lot of fruit, consistently over the thousands of years of our history, is that the better we got at Bayesian updating, the better we got at this, which quantification was just an improvement on how well we updated, how fine-grained we updated. We didn't just like say, call it 100 when it's 90, call it nothing, no chance of happening when it's really 10% chance of happening. All these biases, numbers helped us. They were the defense. Numbers are a defense against delusions. They are a defense, and they are justice, right? I think that's often missing in this community, is that when you quantify something, it is eventually the most fair way to do justice to everyone's experiences without saying one person's experience is worth more than the other, and still be able to be a community and like talk together about like I know that I know that we all care about everyone's suffering, not just my own, not just yours. And so when we have a conversation, I'm not just myopic about like, I only care about my bliss and I don't know how yours is. Maybe you're totally fine being tortured. Who am I to say? And so it's not going to be a right of yours to not be tortured. If you want to be tortured, this is the kind of, I would say, borders line on sophistry eventually. And the numbers help keep that at bay. I would say, okay, if you push anyone to the numbers, you can always say the technology is not there yet, right? But it is the frontier worth pushing on, and every time we push on that frontier, we seem to get fruits. I mean, yes, there are times when science and power gets used wrongly, but power, is always dangerous, and we have to have some dangerous dreams here.
Yeah, I would mostly agree with that, except I would actually say that there is one thing that we actually have made almost no progress on, which isn't to say that we haven't clarified the question or that we haven't made progress in formulating what it is that still remains a mystery. But basically, it's the hard problem of consciousness, right? That link between the subjective experience and the objective one. Beyond finding the correlates, beyond doing that, right? Ultimately, we haven't really made any progress there, besides people basically coming back to forms of dualism, which I find actually myself very attractive in terms of a naturalistic dualism that just, the subjective and the objective are fundamental ontological realities, and that's just the way it is. That seems to be where the science is pushing us, which is sort of the irreconcilability of these things.
So QRI has a couple leads on this. So QRI is both the biggest proponent of how most theories do not solve the hard problem of consciousness, as well as they have started proposing some non-trivial potential solutions. I'm not the best explainer of these. Andres would be, but my understanding is that topological segmentation of consciousness, kind of little like Bernardo Castro, right? And so I would say one other ism here, right, is dual aspect monism. I would say that's actually where Andres and QRI people would sit.
That's a good name for what I would call naturalistic dualism, but I like the sound of that better because it emphasizes the unity, dual aspect monism. All right, that's good. I had to have that one in my vocabulary. So it's
pretty conciliant with like the inside outside views, and pretty conciliant with pantheism, with the deflationary understanding of what consciousness can be at its most fundamental. It can just be mind dust. So it's not to say that like they all experience valence in the same ways that we do, or even construct a qualia field like we do. Hydrogen atoms probably are a topological segmented pocket of consciousness, but not in a very deflationary sense, in a like a not as meaningful kind of way, perhaps, kind of says, although we don't know, we need to run the math.
Well, let me ask you this, because this kind of segues into some of these other issues here. So like, if let's say there is mind dust that's just hydrogen atoms, let's say, those aren't suffering, right? The hydrogen atoms aren't suffering. They're not having those, complex valence.
So I'm not sure entirely if that's true.
Okay.
I think that if we understand the symmetry theory of valence, which is that suffering is isomorphic, or like valence is isomorphic to a mathematical object, the brain state that's related to suffering is isomorphic to a mathematical object, to the symmetry of that mathematical object, right? And so the felt sense, by the way, to get out of all those words, is you'll notice that there's a similar dissonance to dissonant music, and like hands on screeching on a chalkboard, as to when you feel a lot of pain, or to when you have cognitive dissonance, or when someone hurts your feelings. There's dissonance, and I'm using that word kind of synesthetically because it's kind of used in an oral sense, but you can notice that word seems peculiarly apt for suffering in other sense gates for some reason, and I think that's important to look at. But I think also consciousness can be instantiated at multiple scalars, right? And so I think I'm kind of partial to the idea that there's some kind of some kind of larger sentience when it comes to like societies and maybe like clusters of star systems or something like that. And it's a different kind of sentience, perhaps sentience as opposed to the consciousness experience that we're having of a unified experience. But perhaps there's dissonance there. Perhaps there's a different form of dissonance, for the hydrogen model. Maybe that the hydrogen prefers or not prefers, but has a different valence, mathematical, number of valence attached to it when it's, in a star versus flying around in space, or maybe when it's in us versus in a star, like which one is more, correlate with that symmetry. I don't know. It remains to be measured.
I could also totally get behind that. I would just say, so to tie this back in with the emergentist thing, I would say that presuming that's true, I would say that the complexification process is it might not be the root of consciousness, but it is the mechanism by means of which the depth of qualia, the depth and the character of valence becomes increased, if that makes sense, right? So like maybe a hydrogen atom has this, it's as mind dust, is just has this slight sense of dissonance. But as a human being with a complex neocortex and a complex nervous system, etc., I can like feel torturous pain or ecstatic bliss. And that's going to
it might be that we're developing with complexity greater axes for symmetry to happen, right? With greater complexity comes the ability, perhaps, for greater valence as a result of that, and also, as you say, greater, but that means the responsibility is there.
But this is the question I wanted to ask you. So then, okay, so I guess the question would be, is it better, because we're exploring the is-ought element here, right? Is it better to be a complex organism that has more axes for qualia, for symmetry valence, to be able to experience enlightenment and bliss states and that sort of a thing? Or would it be better to just suffer less, in which case it would be better to be more like mind dust or hydrogen?
I make the comparison to Plato's Republic. Is it better for a society to be ruled by a benevolent dictator, or, as the transhumanists would say, perhaps a singleton, right? I would make a parallel there to the singleton there in the future, where you just have one mass of consciousness that's highly, like exerts control almost at a tops-down perspective, just like our brains has a tops-down control in our body and the trillions of cells in there. What if there was a singleton overall of society? I would say this is not risk mitigated. So there's a sense in which theoretically like with most amount of cooperation and benevolence, then yes, perhaps if we had a society that was paradise for these complicated creatures, then we should. But if it's hell, and if we're not taking responsibility, and you're just going to have aliens enslave the most complicated minds so that they can produce labor, they can compute qualia to mine it for resources so that people and genes, not people, genes can replicate, and replicators can just replicate for the sake of replicating, and that would not be responsible. And I would say that no, that is not a better off. So I would say it depends on the circumstance.
I think, though, this is where you get the is and ought thing coming together, at least in my mind, because so I would answer the question, it's better to be a complex organism that can feel more deeply, and that is the nature, the trajectory of the universe. And so those things do coincide there. And I would say that, again, thirdly, there's this element in which, as you complexify, you increase your moral scope, your sensitivity to suffering increases, and therefore there's kind of a built-in mechanism that's going to make those kinds of alien overlords less likely, because if you're able to do that through that complexity of thinking, then you're also that much more sensitive and that much more aware to these issues. And so
Potentially. So I think what I warned you about in our conversations over text is that, yes, there seems to be correlations here, right? But it's not necessary. It's not necessary that complexification must require greater benevolence. It's not necessary, because the main thing that everything gets selected for is like stability over space and time, right? Survival of the stable, as Andres would say, survival, not even of the fittest, but like that which replicates well. Mm-hmm. So when push comes to shove, and if we exhaust the energy in this local system in a way that takes us out of the age of Spangles, which is another transhumanist idea, that we only have the luxury to be good now because of an overabundance of resources. It's not guaranteed that we'll always have an overabundance. It's not guaranteed. And so when push comes to shove, you have a choice. Right? It's not privatization until it hurts. And that's where this philosophy and religion ultimately matters, is when it comes down to the wire. Are you going to make a different choice because you're an emergentist versus if you are a pragmatic Machiavellian? Okay. And I would say there is a choice. There's a choice to say, I'm going to continue living just for the sake of living. even though I know that, and I'm gonna do this for like millions of others under my charge or something. I'm gonna make everyone keep living, even if it's gonna be an awful life. And even if we have the math to show that it's, you live to 100 years, and all 100 years you've just been in abject depression, like severe depression with cluster headaches all around, but you've been productive, you've been useful somehow, marginally so, for whatever computation we need you to do. And you are just maybe barely incentivized enough to keep doing this because you have these genetic drives to reproduce, to want to live, even at the expense of your suffering. I mean, like childbirth and like having children and raising them, the life quality of parents goes down. And we are engineered to believe that that is worth the sacrifice, so that we do it. But if you consider that valence is an ultimate source of meaning, you'd add to put a lot more burden on the proof there to say, okay, it will be only really worth it if we really, really improve the bliss of society and like maybe the child, and then we eventually, are better off in some other ways, and take that much more seriously. So I would say that's part of the crux of it, right? Like you'd had to. I'm wary of religions and philosophies that end up saying it's all going to be okay. Like even if you do nothing. Because it's all heading in the right direction, and it'll inevitably be okay.
Yeah, I
don't think it's inevitably going to be okay.
No, I completely agree though with that last part. I can see it's very easy to slip into language that makes that sound as though it's the case. But I don't think that is the case. And again, this is where I also keep coming back to this issue of agency, because as you complexify, your degrees of freedom increase, so that increasingly, no, you're not bound by the laws of things. You're increasingly able to, move uphill against the flow of energy, and you're able to move counter to, certain more simplistic mechanistic laws. I should, increasingly emphasize this idea, because I don't mean to suggest in any way that sort of we can let our hands off the steering wheel and we'll just be taken on the road to Omega, right? It means actually that as we complexify, we need to be more intentional about moving in this direction because of our freedom. And so I do see a difference there. It's maybe a subtle one, but it's just the notion that there is at core a kind of deep logic to this process. But you can have logical processes. You can have processes that are, I hesitate to use the word mechanistic because that's not quite it. So I guess I'll stick with logic. You can have processes with deep logics that don't necessarily make them inevitable. And I am very much of the mind that you can have teleology without speaking of that as inevitable, that there is something that this depends upon us in certain ways. And so I guess
I will say, though, that there's it is possible that there are two attractors, and that you have one that has, to become the apotheosis into what kind of God we become. There are different ones. And so maybe if you positioned emergentism as against certain other gods, right, then you would make the mimetic war, more clearly like in the forefront of like, this is what we're here to do.
I think that's exactly right, though. Gods. But actually, that's a great way of framing why I started naming these other isms: utilitarianism, Gnosticism, transhumanism, because emergentism I position against those other memes and saying, no.
I would say, I think that's already too low level. Like I would say at the biggest level, like that's a little bit more like strategy talk. Okay, that's more like tactics. Like you're against this tactic, you're for that tactic. I would say if you think about value, like what the thing is that we're optimizing for at the end of the day, right? Like even if you don't want to take a mathematical approach to it because you think the real way to do the greatest justice to living a meaningful life for the most amount of people or whatever, sure, that's just tactics, but you're still on the same team. Who's not on the team are people like, here's some other potential gods. The people who want to just replicate and give everything else up. And again, because of the is our all problem, is all divide, it is not a priori true. Like there's no omnipotent God above those gods, above the replicators or above consciousness as we like it, who will say, you're wrong, replicators. Sorry, bye. Like you're off the island because you're wrong. No, there's just us versus them. And they're not real people, by the way. Replicators are not people. They're memes. So They are like trauma that gets replicated over generations. Like intergenerational trauma is a pre-replicator. That's not really anyone. That's just a meme. And I would say that there's the third one that Andres has pointed out, which is a faction that only cares about having the biggest effect size, like the most amount of power, most amount of impact on everything. It doesn't even matter what the power is. It's just going to be Machiavellian. It's going to do whatever it takes to have the most influence on everything and have the biggest impact. Very neutral, kind of like neutral versus like, in our viewpoint, like neutral evil and like us on the good side of things. But there is no ultimate arbiter of that. And so I would say we got to lose, as Hansi says, our innocence that says, our haughtiness that says emergentism is like, oh, if only you knew how the world is, like you would obviously be on emergentism. No, at the final straw, you have to assert that we care for no good, no good, like real reason to care. Like, if you start bridging into the fact that like better valence and better feeling people lead to more productivity, so you can reproduce better and replicate better and be more resilient over time, and you have this complexity argument that complexity is good for resilience and for life to flourish. Yeah, but that's a nice story when it comes down to the wire. Okay, like when it comes down to I have like 2 bread left, and I either like choose to give it to the person who is living an awful life, or giving it to the person who's living a good life, but maybe slightly less productive, slightly less able to be stable and reproduce over time, right? Like this, when we get down to the wires, where we gotta sober up and think a little bit about how, okay, there can be a trade-off. Like maybe greater complexity doesn't lead to greater valence sometimes, right? Like maybe we want you to be a better machine to compute reality, so that we can like get more resources, even at the cost of you. Like maybe the agony is adaptive. Right? Maybe the delusions are adaptive, and we find that is very, very motivating. Unfortunately,
so there's a lot I could get into all there, and I think that all this stuff is very fascinating and important. But I want to zero in, I guess, on one thing, which is because I think we might probably agree on this as well. What is the basis for the decision when you say, you choose something and you will something and all that?
Very good.
What is that based on?
Yeah. So this is where the Bodhisattva comes in, right? You just got to make a vow. Why do you make the vow? It's not going to be backed up by any logic. It can't. Ultimately, fundamentally, at the last second, no. At the last instance, it's not. It's backed up by the heart. Just a very uniquely human thing. Or so as far as we know, right? And we project it and we think that like other creatures, if only they knew, and if only they weren't in pain all the time, they would be friendly, nice little leopards. They wouldn't be carnivorous. They would care, and they would be compassionate. Maybe. We haven't talked to them. I would say, as from a transhumanist perspective, by the way, we might even have responsibility to grow the complexity of all the other species we keep around, so that they have the possibility for greater valence. Like our minds, and then grow our own minds too. And so everyone's spiraling in sentience and super sentience and intelligence. And if you're not doing that, you should kill them off. Because if you decided that they weren't worthy of apotheosis and transcendence into super intelligence, why? Why did you decide they weren't worthy? Maybe because their nervous systems and ganglia stems are not a good instantiation of consciousness. Maybe they are just very, not great hardware when it comes to having bliss. They're just not cut out. Like there's like a limit to that. And so, okay, that makes sense. You should have more humans instead of cockroaches, for example, because and you can never grow cockroaches to the human level. Maybe. I know I veered a little bit there, but that's a little bit of the transhumanist speaking. And ultimately, the transhumanists that I like are the ones who take this as a priori, like Buddhist, the Bodhisattva vow of like, oh yeah, of course we want to eliminate suffering for all sentient beings. But that's an intuition leap. That's not in the is.
Well, that's very interesting though to me, because I think you're getting at the very thing that I was sort of trying to preserve by suggesting that ultimately things don't all come down to the math, right? I think that what you're saying, that sort of heart, that intuition, it can be certainly hyper romanticized into all sorts of articulations of that idea. But I think at core, there is something very valuable at saying that, yeah, in the last analysis, you can't just make it about logic, that there's something else going on there. And it seemed like that was sort of an idea that was being negated by the notion of being able to mathematically describe all qualia, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, right? Yeah. It's only in the last instance. Like in any company, when you do a strategy, you have to say, okay, we're going to maximize profits. And then you do the strategy after that, which is very based on deductive logic. But why are you maximizing the profits? How do we all decide that's what we want to do here? Well, because of capital. Why did you decide to start a company? If you keep following this thread of why are you doing anything that you're really doing, you're going to notice that there's something there.
Question there. So can that be probed any further in the sense of when you say in the last analysis, you have to just make a decision on the heart? Could it be that what we're thinking of as the heart is just, that there are things going on there that we might not be aware of logically, but they have a logical and even a material basis that we're intuiting. We just lack the explanatory framework to be able to put it in those terms.
So I believe so. I believe we're intuiting kind of like we're intuiting kind of like a path of least resistance kind of analogy here with light, where light just goes in a certain way, not like arbitrarily, like light didn't really choose that path. If you fully understood all the choices available, everything else canceled out. And I think it's a little bit like that. There's these like valence landscapes, like these energy flows through us, and we follow our intuition, is guided by a moral phenomenology, like what is the felt sense of something being true or right or conciliant or meaningful or fulfilling or salient is a common qualia, I would say, across humans at the very least. And then we're just guided by that. And another way to say it poetically is that we're guided by beauty, what seems to be the most beautiful consonant image or conceptual construct to believe in when we imagine it, when it crosses our experience of like contemplating it, and we're like, oh, we like that one because that one feels more beautiful of an idea to live into. And so maybe people have some dissonance around math from the way we learned math, from our, from the kind of people who didn't meditate but did a lot of math, like the kind of experiences we have associated with math has been maybe a little traumatized and filled with dissonance. I found spirituality through math. That was my first experience of a eureka, wow, amazing experience. Hours on hours, dozens of hours of problem sets across like multiple different math classes, and then realizing below the language of math is the experience of math. And then when I got to that level, I was like, oh, I see what all these words were pointing to. And there was like this like mathematical like mini enlightenment. It was great. And I was like, oh, this is like almost a mystical experience of everything making sense.
Well, let me ask you this though. You raise the idea that there are multiple attractors, and I would totally agree with that. But you sort of said it emphatically and dogmatically that there's not some attractor above that we're on our own when it comes to that. How are you so sure? How do you know that these sorts of deep experiences of whether they're enlightenment or transcendence or this or that might be putting us in touch with something that really is beyond the more immediate attractors as some sort of ultra attractor? Does that make sense as a question? Because I can also try to reformulate.
I'm not so sure. I guess I did make it sound like I was so sure, right? I think I make it sound sure from a functional perspective. You could posit one, but we don't have much data on them at all. Like how would you know, right? Like, and because it's not even wrong to posit it, because you can't falsify it. You can't really, you could say the opposite and it'd be equally as true, but then you would evaluate these narratives based on how skillful they are for the things that you do know that you want to care about. If you chose to care about consciousness and have in bliss, then fight for it. And don't believe, it's not useful to believe that there's some, granddaddy God who will like be on your side, because it's not helpful. You got to be a warrior of peace. You got to be a warrior of bliss. And that means being in the game, strategizing, like getting the help that you need, getting community, like building paradise, engineering it with your own hands.
Yeah, I agree. I think largely what coheres what people are calling the liminal web or this metamodern ecosystem is something like that. And I think that takes many forms for different people and activates different skill sets with people, different capacities, and that we need all of them. I know people in tech, I know people in, probing Andre's probing the geometry of valence, and people in neuroscience and people in the sciences and people in the arts, et cetera, and we also need people storytellers, and we need spiritual guides and that sort of thing. So it's a all hands on deck cultural project. In many ways, that is sort of the building the cathedral thing. It's not just symbols for the divine, it's the instantiation, the realization, and the manifestation of the divine and paradise in the world. So I agree with all that. One of the questions, though, I guess I'll try to bring back in here is there's sort of a metaphysical is that I think is really profound. I guess what Nietzsche called the problem of Silenus, which is the problem of nihilism, right? So Silenus, right? It's the truths of Silenus. He said, the best thing that you could ever do is to not have been born. The second best thing you could do is to die as soon as possible, right? And Nietzsche picks this up, and he's like, why is this not true? Or is it true? If it is true, then you're dealing with sort of the crux of nihilism and stuff that Schopenhauer was getting into. And also, of course, Schopenhauer was deep into Buddhism and the Eastern spiritual traditions that sort of confronted this issue. So I guess my question ultimately does revolve around that question of the truth of Silenus, is to say that, which also plugs in the Gnosticism question that I wanted to get to, which is, if suffering is just this ultimate evil, if it's the thing that sort of that grounds all of our or informs all the actions that we take, and it basically characterizes so much of our lived experience, and everything that we do should be motivated towards its amelioration or eradication. And if that's not a given, and if there's no one upstairs who's necessarily going to ensure or even help ensure that maybe we're on a good path towards doing that, and we might all soon become slaves of some evil robotic overlords who are, subjugating us to endless torture so that we can be nice replicating robots. Then do we just off ourselves? I guess the best way to ask this question would be, might the best, most moral action for someone to commit be to just destroy the whole planet? Because then everything's mind dust again, and maybe the most dissonance you might feel is just a little perturbation, rather than torture.
So a couple things there, right? This is very serendipitous, because just the other day the problem Silenus came up over Christmas, and someone was bringing it, because of course my Christmas involves philosophical conversations like this. So a couple things. There is like kind of I think I've heard people refer to it, the death drive in like Theravadan Buddhism, right? There's this sense of like nirvana is a cessation. They call it a cessation in the pragmatic Dharma community, and in even some more, traditional texts. It's a cessation of experience. Essentially, you're unborn. And when I've experienced this is it's not that you experience it, but when I experience coming down from it, when I experience coming back from it, it feels amazing. And so can lead to this idea that the closer you are to not having existed, the better it is. And so, our friend, so Raja Tisdale and I talked about this, and we're like, maybe there's no real pleasure the way that we think of it. Like, it might be that there's only the cessation of suffering, and that there's only the cessation of suffering. And when you experience heightened states of well-being on heightened concentration states, you learn in meditation, for example, that the jhanas are not the ultimate state of bliss, and that they're not preferable over, fourth path. And when you do fourth path, or like the technical fourth path that Daeongrim talks about, it feels like, you could take it or leave it. It's not really the most salient thing anymore. And so maybe, right? But when we said, okay, Roger Tisdale and Andrews had a conversation, and they were like, okay, what do we do with this? Like, how do you optimize for valence? If optimize for valence just means kill everybody, or like just go into Dharmakaya and have non-existence and have everyone evaporate. I've also had narrative once that came upon me that was like, yes, at the end of this $1 trillion arc of the universe, the ultimate end will be the Buddha. What does it mean for the Bodhisattvas to actually win? What was the win condition? The condition is you convert everyone into Bodhisattva. So all sentient beings are all fully aligned on like this task of ending suffering for all sentient beings. Okay, but how does it end ultimately? Well, if you believe in consilience with this idea of the Dharmakaya, then you would have everyone at the same time be completely hyper coordinated, like an Indra's web. Everyone would be like fully like enlightened, and then they would all decide that we're going to shut down the simulation. We're going to shut down this entire universe. That way, you can be maybe ultimately responsible and ensure that just because you disappeared, there won't be further sentient beings born. And maybe what you'd have to do is make sure that there's no further sentient beings born in this universe, as well as any offspring universes, because maybe there's cosmic Darwinism, and maybe there's universes that replicate universes, and there might be future lives in all the black holes that we're not able to get into today. But maybe in the future, if there's even a sliver of an infinitesimal chance that you can go into a black hole and then make sure that you're responsible as Bodhisattva in that universe to spread your memes to reduce suffering, then yes, maybe ultimately you need to spread death to all universes and ultimate death. Maybe in the last instance, that might be true, okay? But until the last instance, a couple of things. It's not responsible to off yourself now, right? You have no reason to believe that just because you off yourself now, you haven't, in the grand scheme of the next trillion years, optimized for valence for all sentient beings everywhere. Like, who knows, the ones that didn't choose to off themselves are precisely the ones that you would rather not have the power to be around. You would have rather been around rather than them because you cared enough to off yourself and they didn't care enough. So, you see how like you got to fight this war to the end. You can't just, take the easy way out.
I think that this does get at a real profound and really the most profound, I think, difference, if there is one. And you left it open. You said maybe that in the ultimate case is the thing. I totally disagree. I think that and this, call it what you will, it's a kind of intuition of the heart. It's having experienced the nihilism and found actually metamodernism by means of the connection between the affirmation and the will to be and to say yes to life. And a lot of this does come out of my engagement with Nietzsche as well and all that. I think that any worldview that espouses the absolute aim to lie in non-existence and the destruction of all consciousness, I would say is not one that I support, to put it mildly, right? Which is why, I mean, my notion of the Omega is ultimate consciousness. It's ultimate. It is the pure bliss state of maximal complexity, goodness, agency, beauty, consonance, etc. Right? So I can get behind that telos. I can't get behind the telos of the negation and the void and the nothingness.
Let me reframe the negation for you. Let me steel man this for you.
Okay.
I get where you're coming from. I would also be wary of any philosophy that seems like it's trying to, be life not affirming. Okay. But if you consider, I don't know how much you've experienced non-existence or how much you've not experienced it. But
I've experienced it all. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know how to answer that question, but I'll try to.
Yeah. But there's this sense in which perhaps consciousness as we know it and experience it only comes around when there's information to be integrated. And when you have ultimate integration of all of consciousness and information in the universe, if you become this hive mind and all your thalamuses are linked or something, and you're like this like unity consciousness, and you have ultimate peace, then there is nothing to be done. And when there's ultimate peace and there's nothing to be done and no information to process because there's no more fear, there's nothing to defend against anymore. When you're ultimately able to let go in that last instance, and all sentient beings everywhere has indeed have no more suffering, and you have convinced yourself that it is literally impossible for it to happen again in all multiverse. What is the ultimate peace that comes from that, right? The letting go that comes from that. The beauty that comes with that level of order. I think you end up in something that is not totally nothing. So Dharmakaya is not necessarily quite the same as never having been born, perhaps. There is this sense that you have imagine like a stable sine wave, okay, stable, permanently. And there's nothing to be said about it. And then people just like store it away. And it's as if like there's nothing interesting about it anymore. But that sine wave, you can imagine to be perfectly happy. And so we have this like perfectly harmonious vibration of consciousness that is just stable because it's perfect. It's perfectly peaceful in the last instance. And that way, yeah, like you might be able to come back, but the idea is that you wouldn't choose to. Right? If you had a choice, you would not choose. Now, Andres is a little bit less, what do you call it, imperialistic, I guess, as me. He would say there are three ultimate worlds that ultimately we want in consciousness. All right, there is this Dharmakaya, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it is ultimate bliss. Okay, maybe you have no experience there. And you have this economy where, like, maybe before the trillion years, rewind a little bit in the war, over the next trillion years, you need a little bit more advanced in our consciousness engineering. You get like you get paid in like amount of time in the Dharmakaya. And maybe, by the way, to be a little bit more sophisticated, it might be that people would prefer to have Dharmakaya and out, in and out, really quickly, right? So you get those blasts of like the bliss waves of just barely having experience, but it's an experience normally annealed from nothing, which is like the most beautiful experience. So you get this sense of like perfection and then being born from perfection over and over and over and over again. And that may be like the closest we got to feeling good. And maybe some people could choose like, nah, I don't need that roller coaster emotional ride. I just can settle for pure bliss. Don't need to experience it as long as the math works out for me. Fine. That's one world. Another world is one where you do have the kind of bliss that comes from novelty. This is a genetic adaptation because consciousness was, adapted for computing qualia, right? And so we are here to compute reality and more of it and make it all consilient so that we are more anti-fragile and are able to be more adaptive. That's a functional consciousness itself for our genes, as far as they care. And so until we engineer that proclivity for novelty to be entertaining to us, you could say it's a viable, perhaps, you could say that there is bliss in endless novelty. And then you create a world called qualia stream where people just get endless novelty experiences, infinitely new every moment, more granular, like infinite novelty every second than you can imagine today. And maybe that will be good, and you have to get rid of their bodies or something so that they're not, you got to really purify their nervous systems, make sure there's not like dissonance, there's not no crinkles, or like maybe they have a really, great complexity without any dissonance. If you can manage that, sure. But that might be a viable hypothesis for another kind of paradise. And then, of course, you have historium, as Andres would put it, which is the forward light cone of this universe. And maybe you go between all three of these. Like maybe you get a town of ultimate bliss, and then you come back and you do your bodhisattva work of being reborn in the forward light cone of the universe, instantiated into another body or whatever. And then you go do your work. But you need wisdom, by the way. Ultimate bliss gives you no wisdom. You're not Einstein coming from Dharmakaya. You're definitely not like a scientist who've learned everything. So maybe you need some novelty. You need to go mine and exploit new information, new novelty, and then come back to the forward light cone with all that you've learned and all the fun you had while learning it, like the ultimate fun of a scientist, playing around with curiosity. And then you come back and you devote that and do your service, your responsibility, your vow, right? Living a heart-filled life, which is, by the way, the heart-filled life is not a life in Dharmakaya. It is not ultimate bliss. It is the next best thing you can do while still being responsible. And so that's the Bodhisattva path, and you do that. And maybe you just go between them, and that's kind of the Buddhist story in a way, right? Like you have the Theravadan people are like, go be a Buddha. And then you have like the Mahayanas are like, yeah, do that, but then come back. And then go be a Bodhisattva. And then you have the Vajrayana people saying, yeah, but like look at all the endless rainbows happening all the time, guys. Like notice the beauty of form and infinite form, and like notice this. Yes, that's the rainbow god aesthetic even that you have at Burning Man and that Andres writes about of experiencing everything everywhere. So I think there's room for all of those, steel manning all of them.
I'd have to really think about this though, because so what you just named is really interesting at many levels to me, because you kind of name the three paradises as I think of them, right? There's like the beatific vision, which comes out of the Christian tradition. Well, it comes out of the Neoplatonic, married with the Christian tradition, but it's sort of the Western tradition, I guess you could say, which is, the heaven of kind of increasing bliss and endless novelty by looking into the, glowing imperial center reality of the threefold God or something, right? And that's just like, that's awesome. And then there's the void of the Eastern tradition, which is its own kind of telos, its own kind of again, it's not really a paradise, but it is sort of the aim of things, but it's sort of the ultimate negation of all of that. And this is why I'm so, one of the hardest problems I have working out in my thinking is that when people talk about mysticism and non-duality, they're often referring to either one of those things and using the same words, but they're actually opposites. You know what I mean? And I find that to be a lot of confusion comes out of that. And not only that, even once you start to parse those out of like, oh, actually the void and paradise are opposites. Then you get into this interesting challenge of trying to see if you can situate them in a continuum where, so for example, right, like even in the kind of Buddhist cosmology of the jhanas, and you get, and then like, all right, so in like the Buddhist cosmology, as it were, the telos there is ultimately this sort of void, neither being nor not being a state, which comes after ultimate consciousness, which a lot of folks would say equates to the kind of beatific vision, God consciousness. But there it's set on a continuum saying, actually, this is even above that. Cessation, the nothingness, is beyond ultimate bliss, as though ontologically it's more valuable. And then I'm like, well, wait a second. Now you've just taken the telos of ultimate experience and reality and said that beyond that, as something better, is its ultimate negation. And you've basically done sort of a, you've made this hierarchy of value and being, but you've put at the top of it nothingness and non-being, and I find that very problematic. So I like this three worlds idea with historium thrown in there is kind of somewhere kind of in between. Though I have to admit,
historium is not paradise, really. Historium is just where you do your work, because just pure paradise is not enough if you consider you are all sentient beings everywhere. So you're just taking care of the parts of you that are not yet in the other two worlds. Maybe in like the final after 1 trillion years, or 10 trillion years or whatever, you end up having no historium because you've mastered all universes and you're able to collapse them at will. And now you might just collapse and only have qualia stream and hedonium, as the QRI people say, or Dharmakaya.
Well, okay, two things there though, real quick. One is, so the way I tend to think of this is that if you're going to make a continuum, I would say void at the bottom, historium is sort of the mesocosm in between, that is the evolving, complexifying universe that leads to the paradise of the beatific vision, or the ultimate novelty increasing and bliss and that sort of thing. Because that is my value. You're going from non-being and non-experience to being an experience, but mingled with suffering and imperfection and blah 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 on this evolving path towards omega, basically. Now, question though, how is the void, what I'm calling the void, hedonium? I mean, you mentioned that, yeah, it's not quite full non-existence, it's just this sine wave that's total perfection, but like, if it's simple, then you're not getting the full richness of the experience of bliss, and it's like, again, it brings you back to the question, why not just be a hydrogen molecule floating around in space at that point? And
well, okay, so we go back to symmetry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how a hydrogen model may not have the access to axes of symmetry of isomorphic, of its own topological segment of consciousness. Its valence cannot be isomorphic to a mathematical object with as much symmetry, axes of symmetry as our brains, because of the complexity. Okay?
But then our brains are valued for their complexity.
Yeah. So the complexity gives you the opportunity. There's the opportunity. You got to take the responsibility to manifest that opportunity of having more bliss than perhaps a hydrogen atom. And it's what the paradise engineering meta aesthetic is about. People have a lot of problems. I don't hear a single good reason that we should not be trying to engineer paradise. I hear about all the dangers that comes from past attempts at engineering paradise. But as a teleology, as like a direction, as a project worth pursuing, as something that gives meaning to life, it is the source of ultimate meaning. It's the holiest endeavor to attempt. What we're afraid of is lack of metacognition, lack of good philosophy, lack of rationalism, just a lot of lacking wisdom, basically. But the ultimate aim, when it comes down to it, ought to always be to create a paradise. And then, of course, you recognize that paradise is in the process of engineering it. So you wouldn't want a paradise that stops. Maybe you would never want hedonium that stops at Dharmakaya, by the way. So the reason we don't call it Dharmakaya, I'm using reference Dharmakaya to cross the mean plexus here to translate, but it could be that I'm a little agnostic to if that is the ultimate case. It might be that the math will show that the next version of 5-MeO-DMT or like 10 generations from now, the versions of drugs we have actually gives you more bliss. And just because someone is in Dharmakaya doesn't mean you can't measure their brains. One day we might have a thermometer where you can measure someone who's in cessation for an hour because they've been a Zen master who can consistently do that, and then you can measure their bliss, their valence. And then if you can say, okay, you have certain level of symmetry in the mathematical object that you're isomorphic to, your brain waves are. Let's measure someone on 5-MeO. What's like the same on the same scale? How are you measuring up, right? Like I think these are open questions worth leaving to the math, and that's the project to get to the math.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. I'd say let's call it there for now. Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. So anyway, thanks, Ray. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bennett.